Hello and welcome back to Core Ideas, a podcast where we delve into all things related to lake sediments. As always, we are hosts, myself, Adam Jeziorski, and my good friend Josh Thiempont.
Hey, how's it going?
And today we are doing something a little bit novel. We're doing a part 2.
Yeah, we've never done this before. We've never continued on with a topic. We've had threads of topics, but this one is just... We left off on the last episode 19, and here we are in episode 20 as well. So that's cool.
It's a milestone.
Yeah.
And, it's been with the bit of a Labor Day break, the start of a new school semester. Do you even remember what we were talking about last time?
I do. I think it was about the history of paleolimnology, and I'm pretty sure you dropped the first F-bomb on the Core Ideas podcast as well. So that's that's how I remember what it was. No, it's okay. It's our show and it's a podcast, so that's kind of expected. But yes, it has been a couple of weeks. You may hear them without much more than our normal 2-week break, but it has been a few weeks since we recorded the first part. But I'm excited to get back into it. So I guess for our own sake, if not for our listeners, we should start with a bit of a recap as to what we talked about in the first part before we move on.
Yeah. And so before getting into the history of paleolimnology, we kind of had to define a starting point, which proved quite difficult, especially when working backwards, as using this, the release date of the first issue of JOPL was not particularly good because that was only in 1988. Same thing with the various dedicated paleo meetings. So we rolled it all the way back to, talking about the foundations of modern science and the Renaissance, which were the key threads, or the giants whose shoulders would be stood upon going forward. And we made reference to beginning with Galileo, but the fathers of, and notably they were all fathers, just from the time periods we're talking about in the 16 and 17 and 1800s, but of microbiology, taxonomy, chemistry, evolution, geology, all the way up to modern ecology. And we left off with Hutchinson as Treatise on Limnology in 1957.
So building up all of the bits that are necessary in order to make a science like paleolimnology. You can't have paleolimnology before those, so we had to see where all of that started. And I thought it was an interesting little weaving through quite a long time period of all these different sciences, and then seeing how quickly they all kind of came together towards the end of the 19th century into the start of the 20th century in order to really kind of get us into people studying lakes, generally the origins of limnology, and then not too long after that, we finished with sort of the idea of aquatic ecology and freshwater ecosystems, and then I think we're going to see as we move forward that this is where people start to dig into the mud a little bit and start to work with that.
But before we get there, one observation that I had as I was thinking about the list that we put together last one is in those foundational figures in part 1, it's kind of interesting how at the start of the list, we're still, it's hobbyist is the wrong word, but they weren't all necessarily professional scientists. It's similar to when you talk about Mendelian genetics. Mendel was not a geneticist. He was a monk, I believe.
Yeah, and an amateur gardener.
Yeah, and so it was his hobby of investigating. What was it? Peas.
Peas. Yep.
Yeah. And so in the same vein, for example, Leeuwenhoek's interest in lenses was not born of his professional career in microbiology. It was born out of his drapery business and wanting to build better and better lenses to look at the fabrics he was working with and then just turn them onto something else. And then lo and behold, this is kind of neat.
Yeah, no one remembers the draperies and and that part of the history. Yeah, it is interesting that you know, in the biology realm, if we're thinking about evolution and other those types of components, you know, they were naturalists. They were just out looking at the world around them. It was really observational science and being open to expanding upon what they saw and seeing it in different ways and applying it to different ideas. But no, it was definitely not professional science in the way we think of academia and university professors and that kind of thing.
One other big one that a notable omission from our list of last time that would fit into that category would be Secchi.
Yes.
And the root of the, iconic Secchi disc.
Mm-hmm.
And again, was he a cardinal?
Just a friar. I'm not sure if he was so high up. He certainly worked in the Vatican. I don't know that he was that high up in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, but certainly a Catholic priest.
And the Secchi disc again was hobby driven from dropping colored plates off the side of the papal yacht in order to get some measure of water clarity in different parts of wherever the papal yacht was sailing, I guess.
Somewhere around Rome, probably.
Yeah.
But also, if I'm not mistaken, Secchi had many other interests and talents and is as well known for his astronomy as he is for water clarity measurements. So a good example of not being limited to a single box of these side ideas that they were interested in, lots of different parts of natural history generally.
So it's just kind of a neat thing when you look into the history of science in general, I guess, of, how these were clergymen and nobility and, while they were investigating the age of the earth, the peasants
people who didn't have to farm for their living. They had time and energy and money to do these things.
Yeah. So I could use some peasants.
Yeah, that's right.
Be great for my publication record.
Exactly. I'll just go and get on a ship and sail around the world and document the things that I see. If there's no concern about paying the bills.
Yeah. But that kind of draws to an end by the end of our list from last time. So by the time we get into like the late 1800s, we're talking exclusively about university professors and academics, albeit some of them may have been doing their field work in the late Victorian era in three-piece suits, but they were professors nonetheless.
As one would, yes. We got to get back to that.
What, field work or three-piece suits or
both?
Combo? Yeah.
The wool of a nice suit is just perfect, in the field. It is the perfect material for it. So. All right, let's continue then. That is a good recap of where we were last time. And now we're going to move into, I guess, it's not since Hutchinson and that time period. We're going to go back a little bit, but focus in on people who we could fairly easily call the first paleolimnologists and start to think about people who were doing all of these things kind of together in some ways, and studying lake sediments specifically. So all these people we've talked about before have been studying processes that are important in paleolimnology and contribute to paleolimnology, but not really studying sediments themselves for the history of the lake. And now we're going to get into people who have been doing that. The first paleolimnologists, even if they may not have identified themselves as such or came before that time.
Or recognize the term necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So the first person that we're looking at today would be Baron Gerard de Geer, who pioneered the study of glacial varves and coined the term geochronology. And so this would have been being done around the turn of the 20th century. And I found a neat quote that he opened one of his classic lectures with, that the name of the talk he gave was a geochronology of the last 12,000 years. And the opening line of his lecture was, "Geology is the history of the earth, but hitherto it has been a history without years." And that's like a pretty bold kind of opening of like, listen up, we're about to turn things on its head a little bit here.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, that's a provocative way to start a talk, but perhaps not wrong. I mean, without having the idea of putting a time frame to the geology that you're studying, that's quite challenging to really put it into the accurate context. And without geochronology, without being able to date sediment layers or strata in general, it's hard to imagine doing paleolimnology as we see it. So that's a really important contribution, and quite an early one, right around the turn of 1900.
Yeah. And we've talked before on the podcast about what varves are, so I don't think we need to do too much in it, but we're talking about like annual eliminations that form in sediments. So you can actually count back, if you had a sediment core, count back annually through time.
Yeah. And they don't have to be in like current lake sediments. You can find varved records, in the strata and exposed lake beds all over the place. And probably where he was studying them, I don't imagine he was taking sediment cores. He was probably looking at exposures of drained lakes or former lakes, because there's such a long history of glaciation in many locations, including in Sweden. So he was studying moraine systems, I think. So it would have been, glacial tills and things like that are being moved by the glaciers. And those would have contributed when glaciers were melting and, as they do on an annual basis, would have been producing these varved couplets.
Yeah. And so I was kind of getting at that's how we think of varves today in terms of a lake core, but we're well before the first lake core per se at this point. But the pioneer, this is, we're 120 years now past the importance of varves, of annual laminations being discovered, publicized, published. I'm not sure exactly what the best way to phrase it would be. But I think, and also with geochronology, like that's a word in common use today in paleolimnology. Okay, so then the next person on our list is Wilmot Bradley. And a little bit later, so we're looking at, I guess, a key element of his work would have been published in the 1920s, but like the first geologic focused paper looking specifically at lake deposits. So now we're getting more and more into something recognizably paleolimnological.
Definitely. And he is best known for his work in the Green River Formation, which is an exposed record. It's not a current lake, but it is a lake record in sort of sedimentary deposits. I believe it is Eocene in age, so 6 million years-ish, moving forward from there in the north and west. It was kind of central northwestern part of the United States. So in Wyoming, Colorado, the Uinta Mountain area is all part of that formation, and just a huge deposit of former lake sediments, but that's loaded with microfossils and things like that that were freshwater as opposed to being marine, where we would have had some of these previous marine systems. So a really interesting sort of example of the way in which you can look at exposure in a paleo context and really look at paleo lake beds and that are just on the sides of mountains through rock cuts and all those different areas. And that's an absolutely famous location for continued work on some interesting kind of Cenozoic through to modern geological formations.
Okay. I'm skipping along at a fairly rapid pace here, but next stop on our list is Winifred Tooten, Nee Pennington. So her PhD was published as under the name Winifred Pennington before she got married. And at this point, we have a potential candidate for a first real recognizable paleolimnologist. So just to, provide some context, her PhD in 1941 was titled An Investigation of Some Problems of Freshwater Algae with Special Reference to the Process of Sedimentation. So now we're looking very specifically at algae in the sediments, and a paper from I'm not sure it was actually one from her PhD or her PhD work contributed to. It was a Nature paper from pretty sure it's 1941. Study of lake deposits, and then one of the opening sentences in there is, in the initial stages of this work, one of us obtained cores with a simple steel pipe operated from a boat and driven in by a ramming weight. These cores show the zonation of laminated clays and organic layers indicated in core figure 2, and the diatoms examined by WP exhibited an interesting succession.
Yeah, that's paleolimnology. She absolutely is a paleolimnologist. And yeah, I mean, there may be others slightly before that or whatever, but I'm not aware of their names. If your PhD is on something that is demonstrably paleolimnological, I think that you are a very strong candidate for sure for that title. And that's some really, that sentence might be written slightly differently than you might see it now, but could easily be pulled out of papers written now. Just the same as, I don't think you could write a Nature paper called The Study of Lake Deposits currently, but the topic isn't the issue. It's just that there's other people doing the same thing. So I think that's some good material there, particularly for 1941, her degree and the
She became a very important figure in the Freshwater Biological Association. So this work was done in the English Lake District, I believe, up in the Lake Windermere area, which I have visited many, many years ago.
But I've never been there. It's definitely on my list of places to see.
Yeah. I always find this a very crazy thing to imagine because within my own family, World War II was a major defining force of everything. In terms of displacement and movements, and just the idea of, collecting diatom cores during the Blitz seems like crazy to me on a bunch of levels.
But science continues.
I guess so. And here we are.
Yeah, no, that's some interesting stuff. And I don't know off the top of my head, I mean, being a diatomist, or at least spending a lot of time thinking about diatoms in the past, I'm not really sure when the earliest use of subfossils for diatoms would have been for that kind of reconstruction. There are definitely diatom taxonomic guides that are older than that, of people looking at the diversity of diatoms, but to use them for a reconstruction, as that sentence would suggest, so exhibited an interesting succession, that seems quite early too for that sort of application of paleolimnology. So really some interesting stuff there. That's a good sentence out of that paper.
Yeah, so I imagine, the majority of the the fact that it was published in Nature speaks to the fact that this was very novel. So I guess up until that point, diatom work was largely focused on extant species and water column collections and water sampling. And then here you go in 1941. Okay, now we're applying it to a sediment core. Let's go big.
Or marine, where they would have been looking at diatomaceous earth samples, which are often used for those really nice, pretty plates, but not going to be particularly useful for reconstructing a lake history.
All right. And then next on our list is Herb Wright. And he was a foundational figure in establishing the Limnological Research Center associated with the University of Minnesota. And he was one of the inaugural recipients of the IPA's Lifetime Achievement Award. So that took place in Mexico.
2009. Yep, in Mexico.
And has relatively recently passed away since. But he was a major figure on, at this point, we've jumped from, through his career. So I guess he would have moved to the University of Minnesota in 1947. So I think he was a professor somewhere beforehand. But 1947, joined the Department of Geology there. And paleolimnology is still in a nascent form, I guess, would be one way to describe it. And he made serious contributions to quaternary paleoecology, pollen analyses, landscape history, and those kind of environmental changes over tens of to hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah. It's hard. It probably would be challenging when you have such a long career that spanned 50 years at University of Minnesota at least, to not dabble in all sorts of really kind of linked topics. So really important work stretching into the more distant past, the quaternary, but then also pollen is really something, and really developing palynology is often something associated with Herbright. And he was just a great trainer of students as well. All of the great researchers who have linkages to the LRC, and all of the work that they then pioneered, often in some ways similar to what we'll talk about in a minute with Hutchinson, is one of those legacies that, instantly ties you into all these different topics, because your work is so much amplified when you have this huge group of students that can take little bits of your knowledge on paleo methods and collecting sediment cores and just understanding landscape change, and then push that into their own little envelopes. That's the legacy that gets to be left behind by these names that have huge impact.
And I guess, you just alluded to it, but we ended this last episode by referring to George Evelyn Hutchinson and his work developing, I guess, a huge group of ecologists at Yale. And basically, we're going to refer to him again because he was pivotal in the transformation of many of these scientific approaches from a qualitative kind of descriptive kind of sense to the application of statistics and mathematical methods to limnology. So then we get more and more into the quantitative aspects of paleolimnology that we would recognize today, I guess, in many ways.
So I don't think we would consider him to be, I don't think he would have considered himself to be a paleolimnologist. I'm not sure anyone talking about that would be, but definitely some important connections again to paleolimnology and just exactly what you said, the framework, I guess, that he and his students looked at all of their studies from a statistical perspective, from a process perspective. And again, as I said, I'm talking about Herbright, just the prolific legacy of all of the students that he had. So yep, that's definitely a good place to jump off, I guess, into another whole kind of realm almost. I think in that list there, we've, over the time period of the people we've just covered, we've seen paleolimnology sort of emerge as a discipline. And as you move maybe beyond that, from these kind of new ideas, there's really a blossoming of it in all different locations moving forward.
And I was thinking here we could highlight maybe some of Hutchinson's students that made contributions to paleolimnology. And, I guess in some ways how our own academic lineage ties to Hutchinson.
Yeah. Most people are, I assume most people are familiar with the idea of this Hutchinson tree, the drawing. I don't remember what it's from. I think it was for either his retirement or a later birthday that someone put together this drawing of the Hutchinson tree with all of the students that he trained and all of the students that he trained. And it's massive. I couldn't guess how many names are on it. But like the main branches of the tree have to be probably 30 or 40. I believe it's just PhD students, just people who ended up with doctorates. And it's enormous, the number of students that he trained, especially when you get to the end of the tree. And those are all PhD students. They're not, people following on. So,
and I guess that's one thing, like I know of the tree, and obviously even today, the number of people that could produce, a tree of that scale is like vanishingly small, in terms of being that prolific, in terms of that mentor of students. But going back to, when the 40s and 50s, it had to be fairly unique at the time. Like I'm just guessing that, but I can't imagine there would be too many PhD supervisors in the 50s that had dozens of students.
Yeah, I have it open on my screen, and I just tried to count without getting into really any of the details, and I made it to 35, and I'm sure I've missed half again that many people, and yeah, that has to be a fairly rare component of that kind of time period. You'd think, anyway. If others know of highly prolific, at least sort of in the realm of the geological or biological sciences, let us know. But I've never heard of anyone like that before. Particularly, and always interesting to think about this, but Hutchinson didn't have a PhD himself.
Which is really, so it couldn't be replicated.
Oh, no,
today.
You can never do that. No, never again.
Yeah.
But thinking about, we'll talk a little bit about some of the names on there that are paleolimnologists or are linked to paleolimnology, but being a ecologist broadly and just being a trainer of students, there are names on here that had no linkage to paleolimnology and but are well known in other parts of science. So Rob MacArthur, who's known for kind of a biogeography perspective, is an early student of Hutchinson, and the names go on and on, including some people that have a definite role. Jack Valentine, who's a limnologist more broadly, have a role to play in the continuation of the paleolimnology story.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a few of them, maybe.
Jack Valentine, just throw it in there, is instrumental in the founding of the experimental lakes area, which I guess is something that we'll eventually have to explore in an episode. But there are a couple of other names on there, and honestly, it's kind of interesting because thinking about the Hutchinson, we're a little bit biased again because of our supervisor was a student of Hutchinson. And I'm going to plead ignorance to see if there's an equivalent name on the other side of the Atlantic, who has was making equivalent contributions to ecology, or who would be an equivalent in that time period. I have no idea.
Yeah, there could very well be one. And we know of this one just based, not solely, but primarily on the fact that, we could strike our lineage onto here at a very, very, very tiny component of the tree.
Well, I guess we are part of his lineage. It's like,
oh yeah.
If you take the tree, if you take enough trees far enough back, everyone is connected. But we're, I guess, PhD great-grandchildren of Hutchinson.
Yep, that's right. There you go. It would be a very dense tree at that point if we got to the great-grandchildren.
Absolutely.
But there is that connection. And I don't know if there is someone on the other side of the ocean who would have had a similar sort of impact, someone working at the Freshwater Biological Association, Lake Windermere. There probably are some big names, and maybe it's not one single person, but at that time period, around the time that perhaps Winifred Tooten had students of her own that were very prolific, and that could very well be the case. And we should probably look into that in a future kind of arc. But for right now,
We're
we have
exposing our biases right here.
Yeah, for sure. And that's that. I think that's fine. If we think about so we've talked about Valentine, we talked about Rob MacArthur, but some other names on the Hutchinson lineage. Ed Devey is one that obviously is well known, an early student of Hutchinson that had a role to play in a number of different areas that would be very paleolimnological, quantitative palynology, isotope chemistry, biogeochemistry, but also population dynamics and the ecology of zooplankton. Like, you can find Devey's name on papers broadly across the aquatic sciences, and that's quite an interesting and unique contribution to early paleolimnology.
And also another name, that'd be, my pronunciation is going to be terrible here, Wallace Thomas Edmondson.
I think he went by Tom Edmondson primarily. So how you pronounce his first name, we'll have to just say there was a bit of static when we were saying that.
But I think it's interesting here that he spent some time at Lake Windermere and sort of getting some cross-Atlantic pollination going on at this period of time. And his research is foundational, looking at the causation and effects of eutrophication, looking at plankton. So we're now getting into the roots of many of the topics that are still of interest to paleolimnology.
Yeah, I wonder how common that was for people to move back and forth. I bet you it was fairly regular for people to go back and forth between the big research institutes in the UK and in the United States, like at Yale, to do that sort of thing. It really
depends on exactly when it was. Like, there's a big difference between, transatlantic flight for scientific purposes and, I don't know, let's say like 1951 versus 1965.
True.
But honestly, I can't imagine it was a huge. It must have been fairly expensive.
I don't know if you think about for some other disciplines, like in physics, for example, there was a huge amount of back and forth between Scandinavia and the work of Heisenberg and things like that in Germany and the Brits and the Americans. Like, there was a lot of people getting on ships and taking long voyages in order to share ideas across. Science moved at a bit of a slower pace to share ideas across the ocean. There were obviously maybe less people doing lake sediment based work, but I would imagine that the few people that did, I don't know, it would be my guess anyway, that there maybe was a little bit more than you would imagine, given how challenging it would have been. You can't just hop on the next flight out of Toronto for London.
How long would the boat ride from New York to London have taken?
4 or 5 days, probably.
Okay.
Lots of time to do your writing and sit on deck and just take in the sea breeze or
be seasick.
If you're locked in your cabin, you can work there to think these deep thoughts about science. Yep. So we talked about very vaguely talked about our own connection to the Hutchinson tree, and that's through John Small, obviously, who was a student of, goes by Ted, but Seward Brown, who was a Hutchinson student. A little bit later on, I think, in his career, he's sort of up at the top of the tree as opposed to down at the bottom. But also, that was John's kind of linkage to paleolimnology as a PhD student. But also on his own was a well-known expert and leader in using algal pigments to reconstruct lake sediments. So there's a connection there again through the Hutchinson lineage.
The next on our list is another recipient of the International Paleolimnology Lifetime Achievement Award, would be Dan Livingston.
At the same meeting, I think, right?
No, the following. I got it mixed up. I mixed my names up. Was it the same meeting? Was it the inaugural?
I think so. I'm not sure. He was definitely at Mexico. I don't remember if he got the award there. I think he may have. I think they may have both been in that first one. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong, but that's my vague recollection without any research. Either way, Dan Livingston, another huge name in paleolimnology, one that probably people who haven't heard any of this kind of backstory might be a little bit more familiar with,
just because of Livingston core.
Exactly, just because of the core with his name on it that he designed or certainly modified in order to use that principle. But beyond the core, and obviously when you come up with your own core design, you probably took a lot of cores. He studied paleolimnology in a lot of different locations, really well known for work in the African Rift Lake ecosystems, which are obviously really challenging to take sediment cores from, hence having to be a real expert in that topic.
And so I guess, that takes us right into almost like a discussion about the evolution of cores in many ways, or at least, touching on a couple of key ones, because at the same time that you're having progression and developments in terms of the ecology, the various linkages of the application of statistical methods to the ecological record, you really need to have a parallel development in the collecting of the sediments that are analyzed under the microscope.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of all of the foundations of paleolimnology are coming together. We've got people studying the biology, we've got the chemistry, all of these things being applied, these sciences that already existed being applied to sediments. And then, exactly as you said, we just need to get better at removing the sediments. Working on exposures of rock faces is good and can be really, really interesting. But if we want to study modern systems and see how modern environments are changing, we need to be able to collect modern cores. And Dan Livingston being one example of those, but not the earliest one. And as we've talked about in, what episode did we talk about coring?
4.
Episode 4.
We talked about the act of coring more so than, I guess we did a bit of a review of a couple of different cores, but it's really something we could dedicate a fair bit of time to in depth.
And most of them are named after people. So we probably talked about yeah, you're right. We talked about types of cores. So piston cores versus open barrel cores. Within those categories, there are lots of different examples of slight variations, significant variations, and most of them are named after a person who came up with the design.
And that's why I don't know how the best way to kind of structure this discussion, because there are different branches and different approaches and different styles of cores, and they're all tackling a particular problem. And so the piston core is being applied when you're trying to get really long lake sediment cores, whereas the open barrel core is more when you're the gravity cores. The principal challenge there is having a good sediment water interface so that that you've captured the most recent period of time. Mm-hmm. And so in previous people that are not myself, digging through the literature to find various early evidence in the literature of coring equipment, I guess it's a white paper, a volume, I'm not sure what it is, by Forslev from 1949 for the American, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's like a subsurface, basically a book describing the subsurface exploration and sampling of soils for civil engineering purposes. That'd be one, of the early guides of how to get stuff from the bottom of lakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about this list and the people who were taking the cores, and they weren't making these designs in order to sell them commercially. They were making them to solve a specific problem they had, and they're very much the people who did them, where they were making these devices are linked to the kinds of lakes that are located in that area. So you want to take cores from really dense slow sedimentation African rift lakes, you're going to need to push through some really heavy, thick sediments. So you need some sort of piston coring device. If you want to capture the real, very detailed laminations of a varved record, that's where those freeze cores came to be. So you can get very accurate sectioning. You want to capture the surface sediment, then you need to have a gravity type of core. So they're all very much linked to what it is the person was trying to do and what their research ended up being all about. I think that's an interesting connection.
Yeah, and for context, we were talking earlier about Winifred Pennington, the Nature paper. It was a steel tube hammered into the sediments.
That's it. I've done that. It works. It's hard to get back out of the tube, though.
And that as they say, that is the trick. And so you have, I guess, simultaneously the development of cores and extruding equipment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the big, thick, long sediment cores are quite easy. They come out quite nice. But if you have a really watery KB core or gravity core, like John Glue's cores, you need something equally complicated to get that sediment back out.
And so, I guess putting some timeline, so we go from a steel tube in 1941 to a very detailed soil sampling Army Corps of Engineers volume in 1949. Shapiro revealed the core freezer, a new sampler for lake sediments, in 1958. So I guess that would be the beginning of freeze coring.
Which is in the States. Yeah. From the LRC group.
Yep. Have them associated with the Freshwater Biology Association, Lake Windermere area. You have the Mackworth core, which is one that I've heard referred to many times, but I've never actually seen one of these. It's a pneumatic mud core, and I don't even really know what that means.
All I'm aware of is that it goes down under its own weight, and then after some time period, it's kind of, I think, like a freeze core in some ways, except after some time period, it raises itself, so it doesn't come up. You don't pull it back up on a rope. It has a pneumatic. Obviously, there's an air component of it that brings it back up to the surface. But beyond that, I've never seen. I think I've seen a picture of one, but never obviously seen a real one.
The kayak Brinkhurst core, KB core, often, I'm not sure these days necessarily see written down referred to a huge amount, but definitely heard referred to as like a KB type core. That dates back to 1969.
Which is a gravity core in that you lower it into the water. It's for the surface sediments. It's spring closing, if I recall the diagrams from the Glue et al. Textbook chapter. But it's not unlike some of the other gravity cores, but it's not messenger driven, and it's, I think, meant for a little bit more consolidated sediments.
And whereas the messenger-driven glue core that we're both intimately familiar with, having used jillions of times at this point. So it dates back to 1988. And so at that point, it's not a case of the equipment becoming recognizable. That's when, the equipment that we are still using today was in many ways, put to paper.
Yep. And many of those individuals who have had a big role to play in the more recent ones, so like Dan Livingston and John Glue, and I feel terrible. What's the name of the fellow at UETech? Richard Niederreiter or something like that, I believe. Apologies if I've forgotten the name. Have won the Paleolimnology Service Awards more recently for their contributions to. Well, Dan Livingston won the Lifetime Achievement Award, but have been recognized by the Paleolimnology Association for their contributions related to the thing we just said. You got to take a core.
And I think we're getting close to a good ending point for today, because at this point we're now very recognizably, in paleolimnology. as we would know it today. We have gone through the list of cores on some level to what we're using today in many ways. But the next real development, I think, was, when you do not have varves to count, the application of dates to the sediments, which we covered in a previous episode as well. But basically took paleolimnology to another level. And, it's like, you're not talking about succession in general terms. Once radioisotopes and other means of dating became involved, then all of a sudden you're putting dates to changes, and it's a real game changer in terms of the development of paleo.
Yep, definitely. I think, we have talked about it from a theory perspective. Maybe we'll mention a few of those names in the next, as a way to start off the next segment, but absolutely that. And then moving on from there is how to calibrate some of these things. So the people who had a real big role to play in the more quantitative part, which leads directly into the modern applications of paleolimnology. So I think that'll be part 3. So stay tuned for that.
On this journey into the reconstruction of the history of reconstructing the history of lakes.
That's right. There and back again we go.
All right. So before we wrap up today, maybe we should check the mailbag.
Let's do that.
We got mail.
You have mail? Oh my goodness.
All right.
When you opened that, did you actually believe it, or do you think it was a spam? Because it's never happened before. This is the first time anyone has ever emailed us.
But no, it was very clearly a real email from a real person.
Fantastic.
And we had a Leighton write-in who's starting a PhD and had a general question about, starting to look under the microscope and being able to separate the remains. So I guess she's looking at a cladocerine project. But, at what point are you able to separate the well-preserved remains and distinguish them from clumps of other stuff that may or may not be of interest?
It's a real good
is it just
question.
a compass sediment or a biological remain of something? And unfortunately, I don't think there's a magic answer to that question. Part of it is just time and experience and seeing the remains that you're interested in from all sorts of angles. Like the pictures in the various guides are always a best case scenario. And it's lying completely flat. It's not torn. Doesn't have crud obscuring key features. And so you just basically got to rack up some microscope time. But I think the other one that is less obvious is develop at least a cursory knowledge of the other types of remains that you may be likely to identify or come across in your samples. So if you're looking at cladocerines, you're trying to separate out chitinized remains. So get at least some idea of what other kind of chitinous stuff is out there. So become somewhat familiar with what a chironomid head capsule looks like, cobrid mandibles, a couple things like that. But that's really, there's no special sauce, I'm afraid.
No, you develop a bit of a intuitive sense like that. I don't think that's not a diatom. No, even if it's obscured and broken and you're like, nah, that looks a little bit more like X. Yeah. If you know what X might be and you can work through that, then it's a lot easier to say, oh, that's a broken bit of something else, not what it is you're actually looking for. Because in the end, if it's cool to know what the things are, but if it's not a cladocerine, then you're going to pass by and move on to something else.
Yeah. But thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it.
We were downright excited about it, actually.
We have listeners.
That's right. There's people out there
that we don't know personally.
That's right. Yeah, that's even more important. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, absolutely.
There should be a prize for the first paleolimnology, our first core ideas question.
On these T-shirts.
Yeah.
That we've been kicking around for a while. If you have interest in a Core Ideas T-shirt, let us know.
Yep. Dear listeners, all 16 or 20 of you out there, If you're interested in merch, let us know. We're considering it just for personal use entirely, not to actually distribute, but we could easily, make a little bit bigger of an order if that's something you'd be interested in.
All right. So we got some in the mailbag. I don't think we've been particularly active, despite our episode about discussion about being more active on Twitter. We have not been more active on Twitter.
It's been a busy time of year, everyone.
Yeah,
It's
been a very, very chaotic couple of weeks. But if you'd like to get in touch with us, Twitter is one of the best ways. Yes, we can. Email is great for longer form questions, but if you just want to throw us a quick line, we can be reached at Core Ideas Paleo, and our website is coreideas.ajaziorsky.ca. But just look up on Twitter and you'll find the link to the website very easily. And that's got all our past episodes, show notes on all but the most recent episodes, because I'm a little bit behind on writing these things up. Yeah.
Sounds good. I think that's it. Good. Until next time.
Until next time, and we'll continue our history of paleolimnology, getting closer and closer to periods of time that we actually have a recollection of.
I would say there's a good chance we will conclude our journey through paleolimnology in part 3, the next one. You never know. If we find, that we have too much to talk about, we could always split it again. But I think a trio of episodes sounds pretty good. Good little trilogy. If you have any suggestions or things we've missed or whatever, let us know.
If you're offended by any of our omissions, let us know. We enjoy all mail, including hate mail.
Yep.
And until next time, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you again on Core Ideas.
That's it. Take care.